The closing conversation, the closing curatorial conversation. Both Mirjam and Pooyan are curators here in our museum, and both on the same, working on the same area. And both they're going to present now in a kind of conversation, a dialogue about a set of collections in our museum. I think with different overlapping positions, no? Kind of. All right, good. All right, go ahead. Yeah.
We wanted to start with looking at some objects. One of the stereotypes about the ethnographic museum that it's full of colonial objects, but actually 50% is from the post-colonial period. So we want to discuss some of those. This one that we're showing here is a print of the Prophet Muhammad. It's from Iran. It's from about 1950, and it's actually based on the drawing by a Belgian artist, Jan Verhaes, yes. who published it in 1867. I just looked it up. And what the artist did here is that he changed it, he appropriated the image, so to say, and he changed it by addressing the Prophet in Quranic verses. This is a new acquisition that we acquired last year. And this one I acquired in 2006 in Tehran. So we have 21st century collections. Yeah, and this is one of a series of posters of Shia heroes, and Prophet Muhammad is one of them. Yeah, we want to speak today about what it means by displaying these kind of images in a museum, and actually any kind of museum. The reason I acquired this one, or the other one, is because these images, they can be real eye-openers to the public. And by this I mean that, you know, there's so many stereotypes about Islam, and this is, you know, showing the image of the Prophet Muhammad counters a lot of stereotypes. It's a powerful image, so to say. Needless to say, it's also contested. And actually, many museums in the US and in the UK stopped displaying images of the Prophet Muhammad because they want to be diverse, because they want to be inclusive. But this, of course, the reason they did this is that they didn't want to offend part of their public. I have some issues with that, because if you say we're not going to display this because there are Muslims who take offense, you see the Muslim audience as one monolith. And I've worked with these images for 15 years now, and I also teach about them. And actually, reactions are very different. So by not showing them, you also people don't get the chance to have a transformative experience anymore, so to say. At the same time, I'm very well aware of the political implications of putting such an image up in the museum, because immediately you enter a framework of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. Because the good Muslim, according to our European standards, is a Muslim who can look at this image neutrally, who can see it from a secular perspective, so to say. And the bad Muslim, of course, is the one who is emotional and doesn't want to look at it because it's offensive. So anyway, if you put this up as a museum, you're actually telling Muslims how to be a good citizen in this country. So it is problematic. At the same time, not showing it, to me, is also problematic, because if I take out all the contested objects of my collection, I'm a Middle East curator. Every object is contested in exactly this same political way, because every object that is displayed in an exhibition enters this political framework of how Islam is perceived and debated in this country. So every object has also a place, a position in this framework of government ideas of what is a good citizen, and who is not. So if I take out all the contested objects in my collection, I literally cannot display anything anymore.
Well, I can, yeah, you can hear me. Maybe you can answer what made you collect these images in the first place, because I think many of them were acquired not so long ago, right? So we have more, but let's say 20 to 25 interesting objects that are depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, many of them from Iran. And what happened later on, if I understood our conversations correctly, is that you became more hesitant to display them, but you want to display them not maybe all together, but maybe a few in a separate exhibit. So can you maybe briefly explain how your thoughts about this changed during, let's say, these years? I think this one was bought after the Danish cartoons controversy, or shortly before.
So shortly before.
Shortly before, yeah.
Well, when I entered the museum 15 years ago, it was 2001, I was looking for a niche in our collections. And many Middle Eastern collections have great calligraphy and so on, and I discovered that what we actually have many depictions of Islamic stories, Quranic stories, Islamic saints. So I thought, wait, this is a niche. But 15 years ago, the political climate was different from today. So what happened is that when this was quite, well, less contested 15 years ago, it has become more contested because of the political developments.
Yeah, yeah, so I can add to that. For example, in the 1990s, there was an exhibit in the new church in Amsterdam where an image was shown, and the catalog described the image and then said, well, you know, actually in the world of Islam, the world of Islamic art, these are exceptions to the rule. The rule is iconoclastic, right? The kind of essentializing Islam. But now, it's a totally different context, right? Now, actually, I think what we're doing is we're collecting some of these images. So, for example, the previous one. Yeah, this one was paid for by the Mondrian Fonds. And when they sent a letter to us saying that, yes, well, we're going to fund, you know, some of these objects that you're going to acquire, they chose this one as an example and said, well, this is great because we can use this for our discussions on iconoclasm, right? Because it's
they also said in this letter, and this was something was definitely not coming from me, we have to safeguard this from IS.
Right. We have to save these objects from IS. And I mean, that shows something of also, you know, how we are kind of being pushed to enter this kind of media debate, and also, I think, pushed into a kind of frame that you cannot deal with in a perfect way, but you cannot also not deal with it, right? Mirjam called it one time a catch-22, right? If you show the image, there are all kinds of problems attached to it. If you don't, there are all kinds of problems attached to it. But I think we came after a long time of discussion to the kind of consensus that we should show some of these objects, just not together in kind of a spectacular exhibition only on images of the Prophet, right? Could you say that we kind of agreed on that?
But I did show this one, but I showed it in an exhibition next to a Greek icon, because as you can see, the other one is based on a drawing by a Belgian painter, but this one is influenced by the tradition of depicting Jesus as the Pantocrator. So I showed it next to an icon to show how Christian images have influenced Islamic images.
Yeah. Should we go to the... Right, so this is a totally different object. This is a begging bowl from Abadeh in Iran, also Iran. And I want to tell you something about this object that I encountered. I mean, Mirjam has worked here for years, but I only for 1 year. And in this 1 year, I encountered this object. And for me, it raised some questions about belonging. So we talked now very briefly on citizenship, but how does this relate to the issue of belonging? Now, one of our worries is that even though we want to abandon a kind of geographic way of ordering the museum, right? So now you are in Africa, now you are in Latin America. We want to abandon that at the Tropenmuseum. Still, we're kind of tempted to regress again, go back to that way of thinking. Like, for example, we're now thinking of doing something with Ottoman heritage, right? Because it is something that is contested, it is interesting. Many Dutch Turkish citizens in the Netherlands are interested in the question of Ottoman heritage, but then we kind of again reduce them to this kind of idea that there is some, I mean, of course the Ottoman Empire is very diverse, but there's still this kind of temptation, I think, to revert back to kind of ethno-linguistic belonging. Now, why I want to show this object, no, it's the other one, right, is because for me this object symbolizes that belonging is a much more complicated issue, and that we should really be careful not to reduce it to ethno-linguistic belonging of one specific group. So this begging bowl has an inscription on it, which says something like, if you want to measure the power of poverty against the power of wealth, smash the begging bowl, this wooden begging bowl, against the porcelain of the king, right? And the idea is that the wooden begging bowl is more powerful. Poverty is more powerful. So if you smash it against it, then the porcelain will break, not the wood. Actually, this object is broken. It's a very light, very delicate object. Now, for me, I rejoiced when I saw it because it was made actually in the town where my parents met. And for me, this inscription on poverty, it had I made all kinds of loose, associations, thinking about, is this my heritage? Does this belong to me? You see, this small town in Abadeh, many people who live there belong to the so-called Qashqai tribe. They are friends of our family. You know, they're known from these colorful robes. And even today, recently there was something on the Qashqai in an article on the unknown Iran. But in reality, the Qashqai are part of the 20th and the 21st century. So this book, which is the translation of The Open Veins of Latin America, on the history of centuries of colonization in Latin America, is dedicated, the translation, the Farsi translation, is dedicated to a Qashqai woman who still lives in this really small and poor town in Abadeh. And it's dedicated to her because my father, who was the translator, he witnessed really abominable poverty. And because of witnessing this abominable poverty, he dedicated to her and to her friends and many others. Now, for those people, and I visited her 2 years ago, she's not interested in a begging bowl. She's not interested in asceticism. She doesn't agree that poverty wins from wealth, right? She thinks that actually, we should fight to make lives of some people in that small town better. For example, undocumented Afghan migrants. And also my father, he would really, turn in his grave if he thought, you know, if he realized that I started to believe that this ascetic begging bowl is part of my heritage, right? So is the ascetic begging bowl part of my heritage? In a sense, it is. But also, something like this is part of my heritage. And I think, for me, there was a lesson there, because my father never left Iran. He never visited Latin America. But for him, the history of Latin America was fundamental to who he was. So I think that's an important lesson, because you can see that a simple object can remind you of so many different things, and that you don't have to consider something that is narrowed down to a kind of ethno-linguistic belonging as your heritage, right? And I think if we do something with the Ottomans, could you... Yeah, I mean, if we do something with Ottoman heritage and kind of reduce Dutch-Turkish citizens to, you know, oh, you should be interested in Ottoman heritage, this is fine, we can do this, but I think it's also problematic. Maybe Mirjam can share your thoughts about what you think, I mean, our collection of Ottoman objects consists of, and why, what we can do with it, where are some of the other pitfalls?
Yeah, well, what was very strange is that we are both very critical, and then we were asked this question for the upcoming permanent, semi-permanent display, where we have to do something with the Turks. And we said, oh, Ottoman heritage. Right. And how come that we tend to go back to these very reductive ideas about people, that they can only connect with heritage if it's their own, from their own country or their own history? And why shouldn't we say that Turks can connect to other histories? Actually, the exhibition that I curated that attracted a large Turkish audience was an exhibition about Palestine. So why do we think that we should engage Turks with Turkish objects? I think that's... I think it's, well, I come back to the political again. For me, it's very problematic also from a political point of view, because the way the Dutch government speaks about Turkish citizens or Iranian or Jordanian citizens as migrants. Even third generation Turks are called migrant, or people with a migration background, as it is now. So if we, in the museum, treat them like foreigners, they are Turkish, they live in the Netherlands for 3 generations, but we should connect with them through Ottoman heritage. We also treat them like foreigners and as migrants. For me, it's problematic. Can we not think of ways that are more generous?
Yeah, so I showed you an encounter that I personally had. Another would be an intern who was here, a Dutch Muslim whose parents were born in Suriname, and she worked with me on several visual Islamic objects, not from Suriname, but for example from the Ottoman Empire or from Iran. And working with those objects expanded her imagination in a kind of slow way as an intern, just like working closely with this one begging bowl expanded my imagination in a slow way. And I think what we're worried about is by doing it fast in a kind of, you know, small exhibit that is supposed to attract Dutch Turks or Muslims, just in general, it's very hard to have this kind of encounter. I think, Wayne, we don't have more time, eh? We should stop and open the floor, yeah.
Please. Woo, great. We don't have that much time, so let's do the mics very quickly. Start with Ruth at the back. You're there at the back anyway.
Yeah. Thank you all four of you who've just spoken. I think there's some interesting links amongst the presentations. But I'd like to ask each of you a question about the ones you've just given. First of all, the issue of cultural sensitivity, as we often call it in North America, is huge for us with indigenous work. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that we tend to make a dichotomy out of this. It's either fully visible or invisible. It's back in storage, covered, or everyone can see it all the time. And people have been experimenting with other ideas, trying to create choice as to whether you want or don't want to see something. So I wondered whether you had considered, putting a cloth over the top and on it saying, behind this cloth is an image of the Prophet Muhammad. Some Muslims don't think they should be shown, others do. It's your choice whether to lift the cloth and see it or not. That kind of thing. And then the other question, I asked them both at once, has to do with the word that keeps coming up in a lot of presentations, and you just used the word belonging. Again, from the indigenous North American point of view, there's been a struggle over what to call the things that are in museums, because for many indigenous people, they have personhood. Some things have an active personhood. And some of the people that I work with have begun to call these things to which they lay a claim belongings, with an S on the end. They are belongings. And I'm thinking about this sort of reversing the situation that you presented, where, of course, not all Turks, presumably, or people from Iran will claim that something in a museum is their belonging. But some people will. And with one issue that keeps coming up is whose voice is speaking for the object. And is it possible to think about inviting those people to in some way to whom the image is a belonging, to be a voice for it among other voices, so that the link across the generations of people who have been here for 3 generations is still possible, and it provides a certain kind of link for people who are not from that culture to hear someone from it saying what it means.
All right, let's just take Inish's question together with that, and then we can answer.
Yes, I had a very similar remark that you should not only discuss yourself, but you should perhaps incorporate people from the communities or from the source communities from the countries that you're speaking of. And my second question is related to the idea of discussing if I should show an object not to hurt people. Do you have this discussion in your museum also for Oceania and for other countries? Where I was yesterday in the Tropenmuseum, it's half of the pieces I saw would hurt to people from those countries. Or is it just because Islam is just on vogue?
All right, answer those 2, and then we move to the next 2. I think those 2 could take us forever, but that's all right. Very quick response.
Well, the first one is very quick, yes. If we put them up again, and especially if we put up a lot of them, I would think of different ways of displaying them, and which people have a choice. Actually, when I teach about those images, I always make an announcement so people can leave the room or look away if they want. The source community thing, for me, is difficult. The thing is, what I struggle with is when we make an exhibition and we say, oh, we want to do something with Turks, and we do Ottoman heritage, and then we invite people in to speak about those objects or those themes that we have already selected. I did this once when I had to make an exhibition about Islam. Then we invited Muslim communities in, but the topic was already chosen. And what I'm looking for is a more generous engagement with collections, that people can say, well, look, my grandparents are from Turkey, but I actually want to engage with this Japanese object. But what we usually do, especially in ethnographic museums, that we define source communities, then we describe the collection that is their community collection, and then we invite them in. For me, that's too late. I would rather have the conversation much more open. So people can engage with museums in different way than just the ethnic, national line that we define for them.
All right. Peter and who was the other question? Somewhere on the... Orla in the back. So Peter first. Go ahead, Peter.
It's actually a very quick one.
Good.
Isn't what is interesting about exhibiting the Ottoman Empire not that it's Ottoman, but that it's an empire? Which means that you can actually get away from the ethno-linguistic focus and look at it as an organization of lots of different people.
That's why I showed this one. This is an Armenian woman.
Well, so an empire is actually, I think, per definition, needs to be diverse to be an empire. We have, for example, a double-bladed dagger from Sudan, which revolted against the Ottoman Egyptian kind of domination that existed in the 19th century. So yes, that would be, I think that would be an opportunity if you would use sufficient space for such an exhibit. But my fear is that we won't.
Orla, and then I have to close, unfortunately.
Well, my role in the museum is as a visitor, and so I'm also here as a visitor. And I just think it's funny the word you just used, which was you fear something. And I guess it's going back to the comment that Rolando had said about double erasure. And the question I have is there room to have double exposure, double conservation, double bravery maybe? Because there seems to be a lot of fear with this topic. And as a visitor, I think fear is one of very relevant to us all across the whole of the world. So is there room for double fear in your presentations in the future? Maybe it's just a statement.
I'm not sure.
You're asking us if we're cowards, basically, yeah?
No, I'm actually asking if there's room, because if we're talking about double erasure, which is like, missing a point and missing it again, as a visitor, I'm just representing myself, but the assumption of what the visitor would feel. I liked what Monica had said, that she went, to the other side of the world to have space in which to just do her own thing, and I'm just wondering, where is that space for you guys to create?
Can I close this?
Sure. I mean, I just want to use this to make a comment about, for example, the Muhammad images. Many of them are from Iran, many of them are Shiite, but we don't use them in that way, right? We use them to for our kind of European discussions. Many imagine that we can use them to interact with Muslims in Europe. Many of whom, like in the Netherlands, are not Iranian, are not Shiite, right? So I don't think it's just about fear, it's also about properly contextualizing these objects in a kind of responsible manner. And this is, I think it's just very complicated how you do that.
And I think I will close here because we are moving to another event. And I think just to tie up a few things, it might not be so. I give you one experience. And turn off the camera. I was with someone who would constitute herself as Dutch, as indigenous Dutch, as yes, she would at that time native Dutch, and we had a conversation as we were talking about doing a project in the museum, and this was just after the attacks in France, I think, in Charlie Hebdo. I think that was the moment, and we had a conversation, and out of that conversation it emerged that we had images of the Prophet in our exhibition, in our collections, and her response to me in that moment, two things she said. One was, yes, let's use it to show them that it is possible. That's what she said. And the second response, she said to me that she felt really secure coming back on the train from Paris because the police were checking everybody that looked Muslim. And so in that regard, it led to a beautiful conversation, and at the end of it, she changed her mind, and she didn't want to use it to show them that it can be shown. But in that regard, I think that it opens up on the possibility and the complexity of it, because what Mirjam and Pooyan are suggesting is also, just in response to you, Orla, is also that it is not just fear, but it is also to ask the question, what is the responsible moment or way in which one can insert these objects within a particular conversation? Because once one puts it out there, it is inserted in a conversation. And one has to think about what does that do? And would it be so that some institutions can mobilize? For example, I've seen many institutions mobilizing certain things to say, okay, they have good art too. Is that sufficient? Or so? Right, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's also always going to be one of the difficulties we have as museums. It is, I've always said it, I like working here because 5 people read my dissertation while 200,000 might see my exhibition. But the reason for that is that my dissertation is 400,000 words and my exhibition is, each caption is 50. And so the question is, how do we find express complex ideas in simple ways? But it is exactly in this entanglement, I think, that we wanted to use this for. And to end with Ruth's point, which I find nice, I think the notion of belonging is both a notion that is about who it belongs to, what belongs to somebody, as well as the feeling that the object gives you. So it is exactly in what feelings the object gives you as well. And that's where I would leave my critique of you, and I take my executive privilege as moderator to critique you, and then you cannot say anything, is that in principle, if you were to suggest that not all Turks are the same, and therefore that not all Turks want to see Turkish things, you also reduce and disallow them from choosing Turkish things. No, hold on. Because you're saying that we shouldn't governmentalize them into being Turkish. But it is true, going back to what Ruth was saying, that some Turkish people just like Turkish things. And how do you address that?
Yeah, of course, but they should have a choice.
Truth. Let us break for a few minutes because we have to start another session now. Give them a round of applause.